Hi, we're Option Conservation, and this is the Shoot Room Sessions.
Welcome to the Shoot Room. Thank you very much for having me. Can you tell people out there who you are and what you do? Sure, yeah. So my name is Richard Kelly, and I'm the co-founder and co-lead fund manager of Foresight Sustainable Forestry Company PLC. And that's a listed investment company, which the co-founder, Rob Guest, and I IPO'd on the London Stock Exchange about 2.5 years ago. And with that IPO, we became the first ever listed investment company focused on natural capital.
Awesome. So career contents page, please. So if you walked up to your metaphorical bookcase, pulled you off the shelf, opened the page, what are the chapters that got you to this point?
Well, let's start with university.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up all over the country, really. Actually, family moved around quite a bit. Newbury is sort of where I consider home.
Okay.
Most recently. But yeah, I went to Exeter University, down the road. Remember, various balls at Powder and Castle, which we were just talking about. So did that and had a sort of side hustle at university. Was interested in the outdoors and used to do gardening on the side. And it came up to the winter term, and no one wanted any gardening services. So I thought, what does everyone need? They need a Christmas tree. And so I set up a Christmas tree delivery business, which 20 years ago, the idea of having anything delivered it didn't really exist. And so, yeah, it grew it from just an idea to delivering hundreds and hundreds of trees every year.
Where did that is entrepreneurial zeal or idea that you could even do that come from?
I think my dad's a bit of an entrepreneur himself, and yeah, I don't know. Just have these ideas and start investigating them and did it. And so, yeah, that was my sort of first foray into trees and nature. But yeah, finished university, got a graduate job with Accenture, a big management consulting firm, and did nothing to do with trees for sort of 8 or 9 years.
Is that a route you thought you'd go down, or an opportunity presented itself? How did you end up?
I think I thought, it was like a graduate position. You do that for a couple of years, you learn the skill set, financial modeling, how to do presentations, how the business world works. I did enjoy it for a good while. So I ended up staying there a lot longer than the sort of 2 years I initially envisaged. And then I sort of started to get the itch for, instead of being an advisor, actually wanted to be the one making the decisions and actually try and make an impact myself, rather than recommending a course of action and then walking away and on to the next client. And so I came across Foresight, and I became the head of product development, reporting directly into the chairman and founder. And in that role, I was responsible for originating new ideas for things to invest in. And so Foresight Group now it's a 12 billion sort of sustainability-led investor, and it's sort of pioneered investment into renewables at utility scale. So yeah, originated several ideas that became £100 million funds over the first 4 years of my time at Foresight. And then forestry was sort of the next thing on the list. It sort of was of interest. It made a lot of sense. Foresight had focused on renewable energy, which is about decarbonisation, reducing emissions, but actually taking that one step further, land management and forestry is actually all about extracting carbon emissions that have already been emitted into the atmosphere. And so yeah, got really interested in that and started investing in one of Foresight's Foresight's funds, the Inheritance Tax Fund, and we built up a quite substantial portfolio with that fund. And we got to the sort of the natural maximum allocation to any one asset class that fund could have, but we wanted to continue to grow the strategy. We were investors like the strategy, and so we had this idea of, well, forestry has been this exclusive asset class. It's really the preserve of high net worths who own forest properties directly or in private funds where there's limited liquidity options. And so we had this idea of sort of democratizing natural capital, and to create a listed vehicle listed on the London Stock Exchange that everyone from, the ultimate institutional investor who could deploy tens of millions of pounds right the way down to Mrs. Miggins on the high street who could put in a few pounds. And so that was how the idea was born, to create this listed vehicle for forestry and to do forestry in a more sustainable manner. And so we sort of put those two things together. We spent several years working on it, and eventually we IPO'd the company about 2.5 years ago now. And since then we've been deploying the capital and building up our portfolio and planting lots of trees.
So from concept of this could be something with IPO to the day that happened, what's that time period?
I think the total idea was probably 1.5 years. I would say.
Sounds fast.
I think it was helped by, we built up this portfolio in this other fund, and there was an opportunity to use some of the assets, some of the properties in there as seed assets for this new vehicle. So it wasn't like we were sort of starting from scratch. We had the work that we'd done with the inheritance tax fund, and that portfolio was helpful. And there was a seed assets transaction shortly after we IPO'd the company to buy most of the portfolio that we'd been building up over the years beforehand.
Do you think that was part of the feature of that IPO, that you could give investors clear sight of that coming?
I think it was pretty key. Investors in the investment board, they talk about, it's called blind pool risk. Investors don't like it. They don't like just writing a check and you sort of saying, oh, we'll find the properties, don't worry about that. They want to actually see, well, which properties specifically, and they want to due diligence them. And then they want to know that they want to avoid cash drag. They don't want it to take 2-3 years to deploy the capital. They want it working in the asset class within 6 months to a year. And so that was a key feature of, I think, why we were able to get the IPO away.
Yeah, we've heard that exact same narrative talking to people about them wanting to get in the sort of conservation space. It's, we need to be in 6 months, a year or two to put together a new portfolio. Risk is too long.
Yeah.
So can you give people an idea as we sit here today, the sort of scale of what you're managing in financial terms and man terms?
Yeah, so FSF's NAV, net asset value, is around about £175 million. So that's the sort of net book value of about 70 properties in the portfolio. And they extend over about 12,500 hectares. Half of the portfolio is afforestation. So this is bare land that it's typically sheep grazing and pasture land that we acquire unconsented, that we develop and then we physically plant with trees in time. That part of the portfolio extends over about 4,500 hectares of area that will be planted with trees. And I guess to put that in perspective, that's equivalent to 1/3 of the total area that the entire UK planted last year. So we're doing this on a very significant scale. And I think, to my knowledge, we're the most active forestation developer in the country. And this is the largest coordinated tree planting program.
Yeah, I'm not aware of
several decades. So that's half of the portfolio. And then the other half is existing standing forestry. And our ethos with that is with the afforestation side of the business it's quite capex intensive, and it doesn't yield for quite some period of time. You plant the trees, it takes at least 12 to 13 years before you get the first sort of harvesting income from them. So we have an existing portfolio of yielding different age class commercial forestry, and that provides cash flow, and that lubricates the whole business. And we've put the two together on a sort of roughly a 50-50 mix of the two types.
On that new afforestation land, is the assumption that it will go into productive forestry, and then even after harvest it will be replanted and go again, and it will perpetually be there?
Yeah, so this is sustainable forestry. It's actually the law in the UK. If you harvest an area of conifers, it's the law. You have to restock and go again. So this is new woodland that wasn't there before, and it will be perpetually restocked and on an ongoing basis. And we also have quite a significant amount of areas of broadleaf trees, which are non-productive. And so I think our portfolio, we're planting about or over 9 billion trees. And of those, about 1.5 million will be broadleaf trees that are planted, and with a balance of commercial trees. So there is a mix of, we're not a monoculture of commerciality. It's a mix of commercial and broadleaves.
Almost. On a personal level, when did climate change and the biodiversity crisis really become a thing you were aware of?
I think it was back when I was doing my GCSEs.
Really?
Yeah, I did geography GCSE, and I remember my geography teacher who talked about this idea of climate change, and I remember there was sort of a debate in the classroom like, is this real? The evidence at the time, and I was a bit of a science geek and dug into the evidence a bit, and I remember creating the case for it being and sort of standing up and presenting that side of the argument in my classroom. I remember that, and so that was when I think I first became aware of climate change. Not so much biodiversity, that wasn't on the agenda back then. But then I think, since I graduated, I've been increasingly aware about climate.
I didn't ask on the way. What was the degree?
I did business and management. Yeah. And it's been an increasing in awareness, I guess, since I graduated. And then biodiversity, I think that's really been the last decade that's been something that's been on my mind.
You mentioned the sort of scale and quantum of your tree planting. Can you talk a little to people about the scale of the ambition across the country in terms of what the government want to do in terms of planting?
Yeah, so the government back in 2019 or 2020 sets a national target to plant about 30,000 hectares a year, every year, from 2020 all the way through to 2050. And if we did that, it would take the UK from being about 13% forested today to about 17% forested by 2050. We'd still be one of the least forested countries in Europe with that plan. It's not the most ambitious plan in terms of land use change. It's quite a subtle change in the overall use of the UK's land. But yeah, sadly, since that target came in, we have failed to hit even half of that target. So we are well behind that target. And
we rarely hear that, right? I hear the narrative of all the very strong, and we'll come on to farming later, but the strong farming rhetoric of no, they're planting too much and there'll be no farmland. That seems to get way more public awareness and narrative than the fact that we're nowhere near the minimum levels that we even want.
We were targeting. Yeah. And let's be clear, the Climate Change Committee is clear. There's no credible pathway to net zero 2050 without hitting those planting targets. It's just not possible. So it's vitally important that we, I believe, as a nation, get planting. We need to catch up and get back on track.
And why aren't you? What are some of the barriers that make it difficult?
I think at the very core of it is the economics. To make afforestation economically viable, the land has to become more valuable than its sort of incumbent use. So it needs to become more valuable than remaining in agriculture. And so the economic components there's three key ones. There's timber prices. If timber prices were higher, that would increase the value of converting to commercial forestry. There are woodland creation grants. Again, if they were higher, that would unlock more projects. But I think the most important one, and the one that is most controllable, is voluntary carbon credit prices. We've actually just done some research with King's College and Imperial College London, where we looked at what would happen to. We looked at exactly this question: why are we so far behind? And it was our finding that it's low woodland carbon code credit prices or voluntary carbon code prices that are the main reason why we're so far behind. If prices were high, that would economically unlock a significant area of tree planting. And you would see, if the economics sagged up, we would see the capital pour in. And that would happen.
I spoke with an amazing marketing director recently who doesn't work in natural capital at all. And they said, the problem with voluntary carbon markets is the word voluntary. They said, if it was private carbon market, you'd be a decade ahead. It is the presumption why I don't need to bother that if it's voluntary. They just in that one word subtly the other way would have made a difference. What do you think?
But yeah, look, for since eternity, it's been free to pollute, and the social cost of polluting and the environmental cost is about $180 per ton of carbon, but it costs nothing right now, unless you're caught by some emissions trading schemes which affect a relatively small proportion of emissions. It's free to pollute, and this voluntary nature of it, it's too slow, and I think it's going to take time. And there is a shift. We have seen voluntary carbon credit prices increase by 30% compound since we IPO'd the company, but are still too slow. And I think clearly if there was a carbon tax, global carbon tax, and it was mandatory, that's the sort of change that is needed in order to realistically hit net zero 2015.
Excuse me. I'm with you. I recently wrote a piece, and my opening line was that the failure to put a price on carbon is the cause of climate change.
It's the biggest market failure there has ever been. Where you got it's free to pollute. It's and that's the challenge. And I think there's a huge amount of change now. There is pressure from end investors who now are increasingly even aware of the problem and care about it. But it's just going too slow. This is a race against time, and it's very quickly running out. And I mean, we just this last 12 months we hit over 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, global temperatures. That was what we were thinking for that was the limit for 2050, and we've hit that in 20.
So we're recording at the end of April, and we've pretty much had 4 months straight of rain. You've got farms already saying we're not going to have a harvest this year for the first time in living memory because of the inundation of water. And we're on the good side of climate change. We're getting the nice bits as far as that tail looks. The different parts of the world are going to get the really nasty elements.
No, it's really scary.
In terms of getting that price up, do you think integrating sort of the woodland carbon code and voluntary schemes with the UK ETS would help?
Absolutely, and that was one of the recommendations that this policy paper, one of the key findings and recommendations. We see woodland carbon code credit prices trading around £24-25. The UK ETS, the prices are volatile, but they're up maybe more around sort of 50-60 pounds. So if we could admit woodland carbon code credits into that system, we would expect to see a 60 to 70% increase in those credit prices overnight. And we found that would unlock over 100,000 hectares of new planting, which would suddenly become economically viable for conversion.
I think actually pretty quickly you'd get prices exceeding the UK ETS because buying that fee with the existing carbon credits is giving you nothing else. Whereas buying a credit that's associated with a nature-based solution gives a company so many more things to talk about, to be proud of. You're getting more than just the
It's not just the carbon. Yeah, the schemes that we are planting across the country, it's carbon plus a whole series of both biodiversity and social benefits. So we're targeted, and we've just published the results of our portfolio-wide biodiversity. We're increasing the biodiversity on these schemes. Our planting program is creating 700 jobs, and that's just for the establishment of these forests that we're creating that wouldn't otherwise have existed in the rural economy. So there are all of these other benefits, these co-benefits that I think buyers do value.
It's so important. So one of my niggles is whenever you want to plant trees, everyone assumes you're bringing in a group of volunteers, and it's a bugbear of mine because we want to grow an entire natural capital economy. And to do that, you need to professionalize fencers and tree planters and all the support and people who are growing trees and sourcing them and delivering them. And conservation, I appreciate the professional sustainable forestry world is way better at this than the conservation sector is. But the assumption is, just get some volunteers in to do it. And I think it undermines the credibility of those careers we need people to have to successfully build.
Yeah, it's a skilled profession, and there is a well-recognised shortage of skilled foresters and forest operators in the UK. And it's something that we've been really focused on. I mean, we run what we call the Forestry Skills Training Program. So we fully fund members of the local community close to where we are undertaking afforestation projects, and we pay for them to receive 3 weeks of training at an agricultural college, where at the end of that they've received many certificates, forestry related certificates that enable them to then start a new career in forestry. And then we're offering them paid work on our afforestation schemes and our forestry properties. So we've run that we're going into the 3rd year of that now, and that's been enormously useful in terms of both providing us with a sufficient amount of skilled labor to enable this level of land use change, but it's also creating, it's part of a just transition. It's enabling local communities who are, impacted and can see the visual change of this forest that wasn't there before to actually participate in all of the jobs and the economic benefits that we're providing.
When we talk about some of the barriers, one of the things we've encountered is the sort of delays in the process of even getting someone to look at your applications when it goes in for consent and the grant process and verification process. How do you find out the scale you're working with?
Yeah, I think if it can take from acquiring a property to actually, planting trees, if it's going well, 18 months to a couple of years. And the longer that time frame is, the more uncertainty there is over that time frame. And with uncertainty, what that means is, as an investor, you apply a discount to your, the future benefit or future value that you're expecting to receive from the change. And so then that means that we have to be more cautious about, what we're willing to pay for properties so the more uncertain that the development cycle is and how long it takes, it is really important. And we're very focused on going, proceeding with sites which we think will not be, won't be contentious. Some of them do end up being contentious, but we try and avoid lengthy, we're trying to do this at an accelerated basis to reduce that kind of risk. And things can change, the timber price can change, the grant raising can change. So trying to do it quickly to minimize the risk is really important. It's a big focus for us.
So have you had that process where, based on either a timber price or a grant situation, you've actually said, do you know what, we're going to pause and not plant this year and plant next? I can understand why you do it faster, but I just wondered if you delay any.
We've had some where there's been, during surveys, there's been some new sensitive habitat or some nesting birds that have been discovered, and we've decided that we need to redesign the scheme, and we've delayed things and changed the design to result in that. I don't think we've had any schemes where we've completely abandoned the planting program, but absolutely between when we buy the property and when we plant the property, I don't think there's been a single scheme that we haven't at least adjusted the design and adapted it to new things that we discover.
I think that's brilliant to hear that you do pause and readjust and change. We've had such a fascinating experience. So you go visit a site for the first time, you meet the local people who say, go faster, change something tomorrow. And the same people say, no, slow it down. And you're like, there is no right answer to the pace on it. We prefer, where possible, to not do anything to landscape for 12 months, to try, especially if you're dealing with something that's 10,000 acres, to try and understand what's even there. Often in our acquisitions, we found very little existing information that's there. If there's not a site team on site that wants to stay, or we aren't able to tuke over an estate manager, you're just learning for that first round before you even know.
There's definitely a balance. It's about designing the right scheme for that specific property, bespoke to the specific circumstances and the environment. But equally, our business model, our afforestation developed business model, half of the business is focused on perpetual development. And so if it takes the difference between 3 years and 4 years between acquiring a property and exiting property, our strategy is then to recycle that capital into the next wave of afforestation. If we can condense that time frame, the impact of that same capital, it becomes so much greater. We can potentially, over a couple of decades, do a whole other wave of development, and that's important. So that's what we're focused on, is trying to maximise how quickly we can recycle that capital to go again into the next wave of afforestation.
Can we talk about technological challenges? So when it comes to afforestation at scale, some of the things that we've had to think about, we love to get your views on, bracken control, fencing, deer management, those type of things. How have you encountered them and how do you look at those type of challenges?
Yeah, so I think the key thing, the key technical challenge, I think the two key technical challenges for afforestation at scale, I think it's the skilled labour supply, which we've sort of touched on, and we have a sort of a plan for that. And the second thing is the kind of the management in the first couple of years after you plant.
Just on the land supply. So will you do an acquisition, you know you're going to have a piece of land. Once you purchase it, you straight into that skill sort of contact there?
So we run it's an annual program that we run in Wales and Scotland. So there's places available. And so there's a rolling program of new graduates from that program becoming available. Now that is a small proportion of the total labour force that we need, but it's providing an additional supply. That's something that we can control. And with we're doing things like we're booking. We're starting to, because we're doing this at such a scale. We're giving the contractors lead time, and we're saying that when we do this, we're earmarking your gang to do this. Same with tree saplings. I think we're one of, if probably the biggest customer of several of the nurseries. And so we're booking in our saplings pretty much at the point of acquisition. We're saying we expect in 2 years we're going to need this many 100,000 of this species, this of this species, and we're booking them in. And because, I say, we're doing it at scale, we're able to then, as if the design changes, we're able to adjust that. But we've got security of we haven't had an issue with tree supply as yet, which is good. So yeah, making sure we've got the labour, the physical, skilled workforce is really important. There are things outside of our control, like the weather, which can scupper a planting season. In the big risk, I guess, particularly in Scotland, is snow. So if there's a foot of snow on the ground for a month or two, there's no planting happening. That's gonna delay things, and you could miss a season.
Have you been caught by that recently?
No, we haven't actually. We've been we've been okay since we started.
We had one the other way recently. A prolonged period of rain, otherwise known as 2024, helped us in Wales. It extended the tree planting season a little longer. That allowed us to get done and dusted and finish there.
So I think, that's the kind of the challenges to think about to get to the point of planting and physically planting the site. So I think then the sort of environmental risk after planting is drought risk. So if it's a particularly dry summer, that first year, the saplings are, they're sensitive. They've just been planted. Their roots haven't, properly established yet. You ideally don't want, and I don't mean like a light. I'm talking about like a severe drought. I think technically there was a drought last year, but it wasn't of the severity that would impact. We're talking of severe drought, but that isn't.
And that causes you small losses, but not significant or not sufficient to cause losses.
So the kind of drought conditions that we had last year on some sites didn't have an impact. On a good site, we might expect perhaps 10% of the saplings in normal conditions to fail in a given year, and then annually we'll beat those up, replant, and we'll do that for probably 3 years. After which time it's kind of considered fully established. But if there's a severe drought, you could be looking at much higher rates than 10% beat up, and so that can lead to extra cost. You've got more saplings, more labour to beat up and restock.
Is irrigation ever plausible, likely?
It is, and we're some of the sites that we have come with ponds, existing ponds. And certainly for sites that we deem to have high risk, we do consider putting in ponds as part of the development plan, so that we've got a potential supply of water in that sort of situation. So it is something we're considering and taking action on. And then I think the key thing, assuming there isn't a drought, is that the first couple of years of establishment, it's weeding is actually probably the biggest challenge. The sort of the grades of land that we're planting on are slightly more productive than traditional tree plantings happened on. This is not on the top of the hill. We're down the hill a bit, high yield class. A typical yield class of the trees we're planting is sort of 26. I mean, there's one property we've got 30, 34, which is exceptional.
Can you explain the yield class is single?
Yield class is the average cubic meters of growth per hectare. And typical might be 18 to 22 yield class, just to give you a sense. So up at the high 20s and into the 30s is really very high. And that's because we're targeting these more productive, more fertile soils at less elevation, lower elevations. So with those more fertile soils, it means that things like weeds and grass, they really grow quickly, and you've got to keep on top of those. If you don't, it's too much competition for the saplings, and the saplings don't get enough soil nutrients, water, and light. So you need a really organized system to keep on top of, things like mowing, weed control. It's really important first couple of years. So each one of our properties has a forest manager who's the sort of day-to-day lead responsible for all physical work on the site. But we then have a portfolio management team that sort of sit on top of that, and there's regular, I guess almost every month there's a sort of an inspection, a check-in on that property, just to make sure everything's okay, everything's in control. The key thing is just keep on top of.
In terms of your structuring, is that forestry manager contracted in or employed with you guys? How does that?
So like FSF is an investment company, so it doesn't have any employees. It owns the land, and then we have contract. So the forest managers it's the likes of Till Hill, Scottish Woodlands, RTS. So they're kind of contracted forest managers, and then we have an asset manager who sits on top of those portfolio, and that's a separate company contracted in who's providing that kind of covers. And then within Foresight, we're then providing the oversight on top of that. So there's kind of 3 levels of checking and ensuring that everything is going okay, and that's our sort of system for keeping on top of those quite proactive first couple of years.
Nice. And anything on the deer side of things?
Yeah, the deer. I mean, it's key to deer fencing. You assess the deer risk at the design phase, and you put, we would fund deer fencing where it's appropriate, where it's a risk, and then you probably, on some properties we do have some sort of sporting tenants who are sort of paying to keep deer, to control deer populations. That is left unregulated or uncontrolled, deer and hare. It is a real risk factor, but it needs proactive management.
Yeah, it's a big one for us. So one of our properties in Big Elder, Perthshire, the narrative around that place, and one kind of predicated on the sort of team of keepers in that environment was always 9 deer per square kilometre until we put thermal drones in the air, and then actually 26 deer per square kilometre. So we've had a first year ahead of, so we're going to plant that site next year, hopefully. So we had a first year of heavy outdoor intensive deer management, and we took 300 off the hill this year, did another drone survey, again, pair of thermal drones and counterclockwise with each other, and number was still 12 a kilometre, and when previously reported by I was 9. So it's a large number, and the sort of guidance up there is you need to be in low single digits for it to be sustainable, even with fencing. Yep. Otherwise, you have a quantum of deer that is going to destroy the fencing, or they get it anyway. Yeah. One of the phrases I often hear is right tree, right site. What influences your decision about species mix when you're looking at the right trees for the right place?
So I think it's the right tree for the right place is entirely dependent on the area of land in question. Its specific characteristics, its proximity to a populous area, the soil type, sensitive habitat, a whole myriad of sort of ecological factors. But our sort of ethos on this is our objectives are to increase the homegrown supply of sustainable timber, number one. And we believe that's a good thing because we're, as I mentioned, we're one of the least forested countries in Europe. We import over 80% of all timber that is.
I was so shocked when I first heard that. Not working in that industry, hearing that, I was like, wow.
It's quite a shock. It's a shocking statistic, and it's such an important material for things like construction, and to be that dependent on imports. And I think it's also the environmental consequence of that. The provenance of that timber it can't all be assured. Not all of that imported timber is coming from is dual FSC and PEFC certified, and some of it is as a result of deforestation. Whereas the regulations and the management practices in the UK, the sustainability credentials of that timber are fundamentally better. So that's our number one objective is we want to increase that domestic supply. We want to sequester carbon, number two, and timber and carbon actually do go hand in hand. Because commercial trees, the conifers that we're planting, they typically grow about 2.5 times faster. So they're sequestering carbon 2.5 times quicker than broadleaves. Now, it's not to say that broadleaves aren't important in the right places, but going back to net zero 2050, it's a race against time. Conifers are the most helpful in terms of sequestering carbon for that timeline, hitting that deadline. And then we have a third objective, which is a portfolio objective, which is to protect and enhance biodiversity across the entire portfolio. And we've actually just published in our sustainability and ESG report, we've baselined the biodiversity across our portfolio, and an independent ecologist has assessed with our forest plans and the planting program that we're undertaking, what is the biodiversity impact. And we've shown in that report that our plans are biodiversity positive across the portfolio. And so what influences us is those sort of three objectives, but then it comes down to the site specifics. Some sites are much more suited to, very fast growing conifers, and so we might kind of max it. That might be a sort of timber plantation. Other sites, much more emphasis on biodiversity, nature, more habitat rich, and so we'd have a much lower proportion of conifers, and it could be, I think the range, timber is sort of, 90% conifers at the one extreme, down to sort of 40 to 50% conifers at the other end of the extreme. So there's a real mix and everything in between. So it's about designing a proper, a scheme that's appropriate for the land in question.
Perfect. We talked a bit earlier about subsidies, and we've got a different setup in England, Scotland, and Wales. And I think what we've seen lately is an increase in the sort of English woman creation offer with a dip in the Scottish. Is that changing how appetising land is for you north and south of the border?
Yeah, I mean, England's had a problem with tree planting, a big problem with tree planting. I mean, it is the furthest away from hitting its national tree planting target. So it's clear that...
Is that the underlying land value that's there?
Agricultural land in England is just more expensive.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the economics of, what are the income from timber, carbon and grants, if the land price is that high, it just makes the economics of it all quite challenging. Now, there are pockets where it's possible, but not at the sort of scale that we're able to do it economically in Scotland and to some extent in Wales.
Do you have a de minimis acquisition size of land when you're looking at the smallest site in that?
Typically, for a standalone property, 80 to 100 hectares would be our sort of minimum. There are some exceptions if there's like a directly adjacent property that becomes available as a bolt-on. We would consider, and we have done a couple of smaller transactions, but yeah, sort of 80 to 100 minimum, and typically it's a couple of 100 hectares.
Yeah,
in size.
Yeah. So sorry, the land value is one of the aspects in England. But you think the grant system improving there is going to help with that?
I think it will. Yeah, clearly the grants will help with that. There is a slightly unusual interplay though with the way that the Woodland Carbon Code and the new additionality rules work. In that the more generous the woodland creation grant is, the harder it is to prove financial additionality for carbon credits. And so what can end up happening is you end up sacrificing the grant. So even though it's more generous, it just ends up that you end up sacrificing even more of it to access carbon credits. So there's a slightly unusual interplay there. It probably means that in England, we'll see more schemes that it's just purely about timber and carbon, timber and grants, and those schemes won't go for carbon credits. I think the other challenge in England is things like, the parcel size and the development process. It is harder. It's a longer, more arduous process in England to secure consent. So it's sort of, I think, considered a more risky sort of development cycle. That said, I think the Forestry Commission, they've just published or recently published this map where they've identified low risk areas for development, where they've done a whole series of pre-screening. And that's really interesting. We started to look at that and to try and see if we can identify sort of specific parcels of land where there's sort of already been pre-screened by the Forestry Commission. So yeah, there's lots of positive things happening in England, but it's starting from a very low base.
Yeah. So let's go north to Scotland, and significant 40%, I think, cut in their sort of pot to work in terms of grants. How's that felt from the industry perspective?
I think, well, the reason for the cut was that there was, I think it was about 70 odd million pounds available, and it was a use it or lose it. And so because those grants weren't used, the Scottish government said, well, you don't, the industry doesn't need that level of grant funding. So that was the kind of genesis of why it's been reduced. The pounds per hectare that are available have remained unaffected, unchanged. So the economics on individual sites, no change. I guess there's a risk is if there's more tree planting or woodland creation next year, there might be some schemes that of the overall pot that don't get any funding, or they will have to wait until the next year. So there might be a queue. So I don't think it changes the economics, but there is a slightly elevated risk that schemes have to wait 2 years rather than 1 year to act.
Are you signed to what the quantum that I get about in terms of grants last year was? Is that together?
I think it was about 44, 45 million.
So that's why it's come to.
Yeah, is it? Yeah. So yeah, and I think it doesn't send the right message. I wouldn't see them again. Scotland is doing better against its tree planting targets, but it's still not hitting those targets. So yeah, that was disappointing news, I would say.
Yeah. We touched briefly about the positive social impact you see all the time with the schemes. Do you encounter the negative side of the social impact as well in terms of people's views of forestry and land use change?
Yeah, we have come across that. Shortly after we IPO'd the company, we did have some sort of local community towards resistance to one of our schemes, and I think it's completely understandable. Foresight Sustainable Forestry, popped up on the London Stock Exchange out of nowhere, no kind of track record, and acquiring land in these rural communities. And these sort of farmers and communities, they rightly have long memories of the sorts of irresponsible afforestation that happened in the 70s and 80s, where there was sort of tax incentivized monoculture planting schemes done in the wrong place, not sensitively designed. And I think there wasn't. They had memories. The communities had memories of this, and I can understand why there was a suspicion. And so what we have been working on is trying to build trust and to try and demonstrate that actually we're completely different to that. We design very sensibly and very considered schemes that we take on. Every single scheme we have a community consultation where we invite any member of the community to come to Village Hall. We lay out all of our plans. We take on feedback, and where that feedback is where it's a valid concern, we'll change the design. We'll make an adjustment.
An example of something you have adjusted or.
So for example, there was a scheme up in Scotland, and there was a real tight-knit community of farmers, and across the valley, we were looking to plant, and it would have blocked their view. And some of the farmers were sort of like, well, I like to be able to see when my neighbour is in and the lights are on, to not have that view. And so we adjusted the scheme so that they were kind of you line of sight through to neighbours. So it's things like that. In Wales, there was some mountain biking trails, and the community down there are quite into their cycling. And so they suggested, can we connect a new mountain biking trail through your new forest? We were like, yeah, absolutely. And we also put in a car park that's open to the local community to encourage use of the forest, and it also encourages ecotourism. People coming to visit the site to do mountain biking, and then they might go to the local pub. They might stay in the local Airbnb. So there's a whole list of. Almost every scheme there's a sort of very little initiative.
We just did a consultation at the Perthshire Place, and that was about certain hill walking routes, and could we improve those as part of the process? And like, absolutely we can. And I think that's where the consultation process is really good, where people are clear what would benefit the team and how can that help. Where they're terrible is when people just want to yell at you, because they're not even asking for anything anyway. When you get that negative pushback, how does it make you feel on a personal perspective? Because I struggle with it, to be honest, because I'm in this space to try and do positive environmental and social impact in terms of what we're doing. And sometimes the quantum of negativity, especially, there's almost a tipping point, I suppose, when it's just negative from a small, and it's only ever a very small group. You end up finding yourself giving back too much airtime because it's the loudest voice.
Yeah.
And I keep having to pull me and the team back to, but there's 95% of people who think this is a wonderful idea.
Yeah, look, I think I fundamentally believe what we're doing is a force for good. I think planting these sensitively designed forests is a positive thing. And yeah, people generally are resistant to change, and I completely understand that. And you're never going to please all of the people all of the time. But I do feel confident that, yeah, as I say, 95% of people are very supportive of what we're doing and the benefits that we're bringing to the environment at large, but also to their local communities. And so I think it's trying to be sensitive and trying, within all of that noise, trying to listen for what are the concerns that are valid. That's a totally valid concern, and we need to do something about that, versus concerns that are more just about a resistance to change.
So thinking about the future, what advice would you give someone studying at university now if they're thinking about, is natural capital a space I could or should go into? What would your advice be?
Natural capital is a term that only came into the mainstream lexicon less than 10 years ago, I would say. It was a very niche term before that. And now it is something that everyone's talking about. But everyone has heard of natural capital. They may not understand it, but they've heard of natural capital. A lot of many big institutional investors now want a sort of 1 to 5% investment allocation to natural capital. But that's a massive amount of capital that is looking for a home in natural capital. And so I think as a space for a career, it's got to be one of the most exciting growth areas of this century. And I think it's a hugely exciting space. And I'm very much encourage the next generation to get involved with the fight against climate change, biodiversity, and the whole economy around all of that.
Yeah, I think it's a super exciting place to be. We hear that a lot with our intern program. It's probably one of my favorite things we do every year. So done it 3 years now. It's got bigger each year. We had 4 places for this year, so paid internships for a quarter of the year to shadow one of the sort of heads of department. And we had 500 applicants for the 4 jobs this year.
Wow.
Which was insane. We actually broke LinkedIn the day we advertised it.
Wow.
They wrote to us and said, you're not allowed to advertise this for free because it's got too much traffic. You have to pay us to advertise this now, which was amazing. But the quality of and sort of maturity of young people coming through now is staggering. So we did a Q&A in this room with the final 20 candidates for the 4 spots. It was the hardest grilling I got all year. It was like they'd read everything I'd published and they'd be like, what did you mean when you said that? And single best question I had was from this lady who raised her hand and said, you once described yourself as a failed athlete. What does that mean? And how did it make you feel when you realized you'd failed? And I was like, lovely to meet you, I'm Rich. Great question. Yeah. So we went from there, but they are staggeringly so mature and thinking about purpose and what they want their impact to be. So that's I actually got asked on a post I published this week about how on earth are you so optimistic about the future? I'm terrified about the future, but I'm optimistic about the talented people that are coming.
I really think the next generation, the youth of today, what I mean as anyone younger than me.
Yeah, we've this up on me.
I'm probably, wouldn't yet considered youth, but they really do care. I see it in work and outside of work. Younger people really care about this stuff. And I care about it for my children. My kids are going to live into the 2100s. That's way beyond 2050.
Yeah.
They're going to have to live with the consequences of the climate catastrophe. There's something
And actual inactions now.
yeah, and their grandchildren will live into into 2150. This is not something that is so far down the line that it's not going to affect any of us. To have something so serious and of such consequence affecting your children and grandchildren I find scary. But what gives me hope is that I really see that enthusiasm and passion for we've got to do something about that in the youth and the next generation coming through.
Agree. So if we look at the next 12 months, if we sit down here in a year's time, what do you hope we've seen change or evolve in the natural capital economy?
I'd love to see a global carbon tax on a mandatory basis. I think that's probably a pipe dream.
Might be pushing it next year. I'm not averse to that idea for avoidance of a doubt. Let's make it happen.
It'll be a hope. I think realistically for the next year, I think progress towards that goal. So, for example, I would hope to see more industries caught by the UK ETS, the mandatory cap and trade scheme. So expanding the scope of that. I would hope to see serious progress of the plan to potentially admit wood and carbon code credits into the UK ETS. I think again, it's unlikely that I think it's unlikely that would happen in the next 12 months, but a concrete plan, steps, a confirmation that it's going to happen is what I would hope for.
Indeed. Richard, thank you so much for coming in. Absolute awesome conversation. I think we probably packed more genuine information into your podcast than we had before. So, and what we'll do is if you share the links to the publications you mentioned, we'll put those in the podcast and the release.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, back to some. But thank you so much for coming.
No, thanks very much. It's been brilliant. Really enjoyed it.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys.